So I'd like to start right into it. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks especially to RBC and Farm Management Canada for presenting me with this opportunity. This and other topics related to farm business management I find really interesting. And I'll start right in with the presentation. Oh, you'll see on the very excuse me. You'll see on the very first slide here that I've written business planning, and that was my first title before somebody became quite a bit more creative and captioned this setting up your farm for success. But I decided to leave the business planning in the first slide and comment just for a second here about the fact that it doesn't say business plan, it says business planning. And so what I want to do today is talk about that process, the process of planning, talk and speak to context around what that process can, and I'm going to suggest 3 key alignments that should be, or I think a pretty direct statement, I think should be integrated to any kind of planning that a farm family embarks upon. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll speak to that and then look to your questions at the end of the session. Some general overview comments. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit here about the fact that our Winnipeg Jets are doing really well this year. We beat Minnesota last night 2-1, and I think we're 6-3-2 on the season. So in Winnipeg, things are great. It looks like we might even have a goaltender this year. So even though it's a little dull, and I read from the chat some snow in some areas in Winnipeg, it's got a sunny feel to it this morning, courtesy of courtesy of our Jets. But seriously, to get on with the presentation here, from general overview, the observation that I have is that farms typically become more complex. There's complexity comes from different reasons, which I'll speak to in a minute. But we have increasing or greater capital requirements coupled with narrow margins, and the way to deal with that is to apply sound business management to it. And some rhetorical type questions here that I think the planning process should consider, and what has to happen to enable the business to position itself for future and for success. What are the people involved in the farm, the owners, the family, the managers, have to consider and take into account through that planning process, and to come to understand what it is they best need to do to achieve the success that everybody hopes for, who should be involved in that process, and lastly, what will or should influence decisions that'll get made as a result of the planning process. So there's 2 kinds of futures. There's the future that will occur. So from this session today, and from 2017 and on into the year 2018 and years beyond that, your farm will evolve. But planning is less about the future that will evolve and more about the future that you would like to see happen. It's not about que sera, sera. It's about trying to plan to effect outcomes that you want to see. And the reality is that all farms and all farm families deal with parallel life cycles and timelines. And the businesses, the farms, and the families find themselves at different points along those life cycle continuums here. So the point I want to make here is that the planning process, the planning that you'll embark upon or work to put in place should be a function of where the business is in its life cycle, where it's come from, and where you see it in the future, and then take into consideration the parallel personal life cycles of the people who are involved in the business now, who have been in the business in the past, and importantly, who are going to be in the business in the future. So those life cycles are quite important when it comes to understanding what it is and what we want to accomplish with any planning process that we embark upon. And another illustration to speak to that is, we have in front of you here like an illustration that looks at correlation of a timeline. So decisions that were made in the past have enabled the farm, the family, to get to where it is in the future. And to my point, there will be a future. But when we want to look to more structure around the planning to perhaps create a different future than one that just may evolve, I think we need to look at a couple of things. So if the past performance, if the status quo, if doing what you've been doing will get you to where you want to be in the future or need to be in the future, well, then I think that's a good thing. Let's just then plan to do that as effectively and as efficiently as we can. But if within this process of understanding where we've been, where we are, and where we want to get to in the future, if the future requires that there's going to be some change, then we need to drill down into a process, a planning process, to understand what that change is, what that change is going to require, to my rhetorical questions of who to be involved, etc., that will start to work through that process and effect that change. And my comment, my observation is, and I think this is just, really a logical outcome of those comments, is the more substantive the change, the greater the change that's going to occur or is what may be needed, the greater the need for planning. Well, the change in the complexity comes from different things, and businesses, farms included, typically outgrow management. And as the businesses evolve over time and become increasingly complex, it creates challenges in how farmers get at the planning process. The complexity comes from different things. Comes from just increase in the size of the business. Now, it could be a decrease in size, some scaling back, but typically, especially when we have the next generation entering the business, which would be the family involvement bullet point to the bottom there, there's a need for the business to simply become larger. You can get complexity that's associated with what's going on in the business, either business unit diversity, different enterprises, and then the organizational structure, just how the farm, the ownership is organized, who does what, who owns what. But we have complexity that comes at a farm from several different areas. And what's I think difficult is that as the business moves along its timeline, it encompasses more or deals with more complexity. And if you accept the notion that at some point a farm or the business will outgrow management, there's a subtle adjustment of the management required associated with the complexity. I'll speak to this later on in the presentation, but it's not as if you go from, in a dairy from 50 cows to 55, or a grain farm from 2,500 to 2,600 acres, all of a sudden we have to do things differently. It's a subtle adjustment of how farms manage their businesses, how they get at their planning that will enable them to take what it is they've done from where they are today, build upon it, and get towards the future that they've identified that they would desire to have into the future. So we had a couple of bold statements here about planning. Benjamin Franklin stated that by failing to prepare, and I inserted the plan, you are preparing or planning to fail. That's pretty bold. I'm not suggesting here today that if you don't embark on a more structured approach to business planning that you're going to fail. But I have observed over time in working with farm families the opposite, that those that do apply more formality, more discipline, more structure to their planning processes, actually, I think, achieve better outcomes. It's really difficult in those situations, obviously, to compare, because we have no no test against. They are more formal in how they approach planning, but I do believe that they achieve better outcomes. And then lastly, Burke says you can never plan the future by looking in the past. The past performance on a farm informs where it may be headed. But back to my point is, what do you want it to look like into the future? So I think that's the key point. And I believe this question here to be quite important when it comes to this whole topic about business planning in general, setting your farm up for success. I mean, it's rhetorical. Well, a question I ask of farms often, and especially try to ask it in workshops that I do: are you managing a business or are you operating a farm? And there's nothing wrong with an approach to operating a farm, but if you're managing a business, that's more a function of working on the business, all the captions, working on the business, versus working in the business, doing things right, which would be more of an operational focus, or doing the right things. So is this important? If your orientation has been more towards a focus on operations, that's not a bad thing. But if you want to get to some more structured approach to planning, then I think to answer the question about are you managing a business is important. And then to start to drill into the discussion here about the foundations for success, another rhetorical question: are you ready? Because it takes an investment. It takes an investment on your part in time and effort. And I think for a lot of farmers, when they or farm families, when we think about where we're at and all the multitude of things that are on your to-do list at any given point in time, and especially seasonally, and stepping back and trying to say, well, what or how would I go about applying more structure, more purpose to my planning? I think that can be a little bit daunting at times. But to my point, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, planning does help. Excuse me. So another illustration on planning. Most farms, well, the textbook would say that your planning activities should work. The planning should start with more of a formal approach to strategy. What is it that we want to accomplish? Where do we see our farm and our family into the future? Drill down into more of a detail towards planning for the business. And I am not going to speak to the typical component parts of a business plan today. That's not my purpose here today or my intent. But those parts are quite well documented in a lot of different resources that are available to any business, any farm. You would have a marketing component. There'd be a component on financial analysis, a lot of focus on operations. What do we do on the farm? How do we utilize our human resources, the technology that we have available to us? Increasingly, or more lately, focus on safety in the planning, and lastly, for a lot of farms, emphasis on how to plan, take into consideration environmental issues in our planning, and then how do we operationalize that year over year. And I think for most farms, and I just want to stress that it's not wrong. It's not wrong for if your approach to planning has been heavily oriented to operations. There's lots of things to do on your to-do list today, this week, this month, this season. But the commitment to looking at more of a structured approach to talking with the strategy and drilling down into the operational planning would be the way to go about that. And then the context to the plan. So what's the purpose of the plan? I don't think for a minute that we should embark on a planning process in any business, farms included, just for the sake of having a plan because somebody told us we should have a plan. We need to understand within the family what it is that we want to accomplish here. What's the purpose of the plan? And one way that I think about this is, if at the end of the process that you work through and you have your plan, and whatever structure it looks like, whether it's 3 pages or 30 pages, whatever has gone into that planning process, if you are reading the plan, would you invest in that business? Is that a farm that you said, whoa, that's pretty cool, that's something that would get me interested? So I don't know if any context is helpful, but I tend to look at that sometimes and say, why would I invest in this business? And now for the balance of the presentation, I want to drill down into what I think are foundational, or 3 things that are foundational to success, three key alignments. And we use this in the work we do with farm families. It doesn't matter where the family's at in its life cycle, whether we're talking about transition, generational transition, whether there's growth, whether it's a large farm, small farm, diverse farm, it doesn't matter. I believe strongly that these 3 key alignments are foundational to the success of any planning that you set out to do. And the first one in the upper left-hand corner is, what's our vision? What's the common purpose in our family? What are we working towards? Where do we, and you can state that with as much detail or as simply as you wish. Where do we want or need our farm and our family to be 5 years from now? The timeline's not magical. I've seen vision timelines anywhere from 3 to 8, 10 years. It depends on where you're at in those life cycles. But clearly, to get at consensus or something written down that states what is it that we're working towards. And once we have, and I believe they're best suited to be in this order. So the first, to get clarity on the purpose, and the second one then it starts with the future first, and then the next alignment is to understand where we're at financially in the farms. And I think that's partly a function of the amount of capital that's invested in farms, and typically the relatively narrow profit margins that exist. But the financial performance, to me, it's again kind of multifaceted. We need, my suggestion is that farm families get clarity on their historic performance. How has the farm performed financially into the past, and where might that financial performance take us into the future, point 2, and point 3, then to get definition around what you want that performance to look like 5 years from now. What do you need your balance sheet to look like 5 years from now? What does that balance sheet need to look like in order for you to get towards your vision? Because I do run into farms where sometimes those are misaligned. And then, of course, we either have to do one of 2 or combinations of 2 things. We either have to restate the vision, or we need to address the financial performance. Because if we don't do that, and we embark upon planning that involves different people, we're basically set up for, well, failure is a pretty strong word, but at the least we're set up for disappointment, potentially some degree of conflict or disagreement within the business. So it's important to make sure as best we can that we align our financial performance with our vision. And then lastly, well, the third thing here is then aligning the management with it. So now once we know where we're headed, once we know what financial realities are that we're dealing with, how do we manage towards it? And you are all owners of your business. That's your challenge. But back to my comment about my belief that foundational to any planning that you do, no matter where you're at in your business, looking at correlations between those 3 things: your future, your finance and how you manage towards it is really important. So I want to speak to those three alignments here for the balance of the presentation. So I don't have a ton to offer up on ownership, but it is about business, and it doesn't matter, as I said, where you're at in your life cycles. But okay, so the last point on this particular slide that other than what I've spoken to already, is that I strongly suggest that you write down what it is that you're planning to do and then communicate it. There's a funny thing about writing something down. One, you're more accountable simply to writing it down. And as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be any great detail, just what it is you need for your family. And then the second part, the communicating it, it's good to write it down, but if you speak to it and tell others what it is you're doing, then that is another dynamic of accountability. It'll just help to bring into effect what you want to accomplish in the planning process. The financial performance, as I speak to this a little bit more, there's 3 or 4 pieces to it. As I said, I think it's really important to look at past performance. Past performance on a farm will not guarantee future financial performance, but it does give you a whole lot of information on how the business has been functioning, pardon me, from a financial performance perspective. We need to then determine what it is we want for our financial future, and I suggest that you look at setting financial targets and investment guidelines, especially financial targets. I think that there's great value in farms understanding how much equity they would like to have in their business 5 years from now, or at the timeline that correlates with your vision. Liquidity targets: how much liquidity do you want or need to carry through that process, because that impacts on cash flow. How much debt are you willing to take on to help you if that's required, if there's some additional investment that's required, and quite likely there will be. So correlations, and then targets around financially efficient the business is and what it does operationally. So the plan should take into consider what those targets are, and then try to work towards them. And then the what if scenarios. So once we've got a clarity on what it is we're working towards, we've analyzed our historic performance, so we know what the farm's currently capable of achieving financially. We've determined what financial structure we would like, or what we would like our financial picture to look like into the future. Then you run your what ifs. I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but I think that there are situations out there where farms will embark on doing things, making change that won't necessarily get them to any better position financially than what they would have done if they had stayed with the status quo. So we really need to test those scenarios against what it is that we've defined for our future. From a management perspective, there's 4 key areas that farms typically manage in: marketing, operations, HR, and finance. And the wheel, you can get those functions to be maintained balanced, but something happens typically in the business, it impacts negatively on financial performance, and pretty quickly we're dealing with issues within the business. And so in the planning process, my observation is that a lot of emphasis should be around the human resources that we're working with. So it's the family members that are involved in the planning process, plus all your non-family people as well. How are you going to best utilize the human resources that you have to work with, and then to spend time understanding what the implication of this planning process will have on your financial performance. From the management perspective, so back to comments on those 3 key alignments, and drilling down now into here, a discussion around management, I thought about using this comparative table here that looked at management more from a traditional perspective and then casts forward what management of some of today's farms as they continue along their business life cycles may look like. And in the past, and to the point I made a couple of times this morning, that farms have been heavily oriented towards operation. Depending on where you see your farm in the future, I think that the decision needs to be more encompassing of all aspects of management, and the suggestion here more of a holistic or broad approach to looking at the people that are involved, our financial performance, etc. In the past, farms have got to where they are today, and some of them have done very well. Organizational structure, meaning the org chart about who's responsible for what aspects of management, wasn't that important. But as farms become more complex, more people involved, more business activity, larger scale, whatever's driving that complexity into business, whatever we are going to factor in to the planning process, organizational structure is critically important. Clarity around roles and responsibilities, to me, is really important. And when I think about the different things that management will be challenged with, taking the business from where it is to where they want it to be in the future, organizational structure would rank way up high in my list of things that farm families need to get their heads around. Convergent thinking, divergent. I think this is pretty consistent with the next generation of people that are coming into the business. Well, why do we have to do things the same way? Why can't we look at things differently? So the benefit of this in a planning process is it creates context for the discussions around the office table, the kitchen table, about what is it that we're going to plan towards. Aversion to risk, accept risk if managed. We are who we are. We all have different comfort levels with risk, but risk's inherent in farming. So we need to accept, I think, the risk, understand within the people that are involved in the planning process where those comfort levels are at risk, and then do what we can to manage it so we can continue to build the business to what it is that we want it to be in the future. I just don't believe that farms can get to where they might want to be in the future without any risk. It's, as I said, it's just inherent. It's inherent in the business. Another really important function when it comes to management is the historic thing about the people involved in managing the farm doing things themselves. Depending way back when I spoke to the change that's required, the status quo, the more change that you think is going to be required to get you and your family to where you would like it to be in the future, the more important it is that we address management, to delegate for someone within the group to take on leadership to help the farm families along into their future. Traditionally, further, I've got five more comments here. Farms could layer on additional activities, additional enterprises without giving anything up. But this clearly, in my observation, correlates to the comment about farms outgrowing management. At some point, the business can't continue to add on more and more and more without giving something up. And what becomes constraining through those adding on additional activities, and I'm not talking about just some incremental change of add another few cows or another quarter section to a farm. I'm talking about more fundamental activities. What becomes constraining, and I guess to my point, that the only one real absolute constraint that farms have is their time. So how are you going to carve out the amount of time that you need to get you to where you want to be in the future? Closed communication, open communication. The generations of farms that I speak to now, they more of an open communication style is what I think is needed. If farm families can get to that open communication style, and what goes hand in hand with this is that need for organizational structure. If you can have the structure and the communication processes open and transparent, it's going to give you a greater chance of getting to the future that you've defined. Compensation, golly, I have more conversations with farms around compensation now than I've done in the past. I think that correlates to, again, with the complexity, the future, the people involved. But there's got to be some correlation back to compensation, to management, to ownership, because there's risk, as I spoke to. So we need to be as well compensated as we can for the risk we take on in the business. Hands-on versus in the office management. That comment speaks to what I said earlier about working on the business versus working in the business. We need to step back in the future and become less involved operationally in some situations. And it can get to where that means no involvement operationally at all. But there is, remember, that continuum along the life cycle of the business to where we just need to be increasingly focused on what's going on, working on the business versus working in the business. And then lastly, the family and personal dynamics, perhaps not as well contemplated as what we need in the future, and that speaks to that life cycle, personal life cycle that I had up on an earlier slide. So those are some of the comments that I wanted to make from the ownership, financial, and management alignments that I believe strongly should be incorporated into any planning process that any of you embark upon. And you don't want to get caught up in what Stephen Covey says here. It's incredibly easy to get caught up in an activity trip into the busyness of life. And I'll pause, because this to me is farming, the busyness of farming. To work harder at climbing the ladder of success, only to find out it's leaning against the wrong wall. And is it possible to be busy, very busy, without being effective? And that goes right back to that first slide about farms and the amount of change. Farms are extraordinarily busy at doing what they do, and they have to do things right. The margins are narrow, such that it requires that you do everything the very best and the most efficiently as you can. But are those things going to get you to where you want or need to be in the future? And that's what Covey's saying here. And he wasn't speaking, I doubt very much, when he coined this about farms, but it applies, from my observation, absolutely to farm families and farm businesses. The subtleness of planning, you can't manage a 15,000 acre the same as a 1,500 acre farm. Similarly, a 50 cow or a 500 cow dairy. Along those continuums of growth, if that's the change that's required or going to be required to get you to your future, we have to incorporate the more structure around the planning. And so lastly, Chris, I want to end my presentation here with 10 things, 10 requirements I think that will correlate with effective planning. We need to have farm businesses, farm families need to have a really good foundation of financial information. In fact, we lecture at the School of Agriculture and in financial management and farm business management, and I flat out tell them that I think that if you had two options to make a decision based on really good financial information or make a decision based on sketchy financial information, you'd be better off with sketchy information situation, not to use any financial information at all, just to go with gut feel. That's how foundational, I believe, good financial information is to long-term planning. We look at our historic performance, budgets, targets as I spoke to. The second thing, as I made a real clear point here just in a couple of slides ago, the importance around how we get at our human resource management, the organizational structure that we work in, roles and responsibilities. That's number two. Gully, as I read these, I'm not sure if I remember to do them in order, but those two would absolutely be at towards the top of my list in essentials for effective planning. Number three, and I experience this in different farm families that I speak to, but farm families really need to get at what are their shared values, because in families, in business together, their business values are essentially an extension of their personal values. And I know from experience that around the table of family members that not everybody will have the same top 5 or top 7 core values. So we need to understand in the planning process what those values are and come to understand what drives different people within the farm family, because it's our values that direct how it is that we act. So shared values, understanding those in the planning process, I believe to be really important. We need to get at what the goals are, and if there was just one person in the business, then there's only one set of goals to understand and take into consideration. But that's not what we're talking to. Farm families are, as I've mentioned already a couple of times, increasingly complex with who's involved. And so everybody will have their ideas around what they would love to achieve in their person, family, and business goals. We need, or farm families that are embarking upon planning need to step back and make sure that they get clarity around what those goals are. Excuse me. Number 5, active communication. Because as what I've spoken, if we don't communicate, and what I mean by active, it's not the one-off communication that happens in the half-ton on the way to town to get parts. It's not the one-off communication that occurs around Sunday supper. It's purposed discussion. It's communication around a plan. It's communication in the form of meeting structure, so that we know that when we're communicating that everybody's present, and within that communication, the benefit of that is, if you can get to that active communication, is it entrenches accountability to people doing what they say they're going to do, doing what needs to get done to get the business to where everybody stated they want it to be in the future. We need to, in that planning process, contemplate risk and people's tolerance for risk, and then how to mitigate the different levels of risk and take those different personalities and personal risk tolerances into account in the planning. Compensation to ownership, management, and labor. Because what I watch happen in farms, and I think can be detrimental to the planning process, is where those discussions get blurred. Because compensation to ownership is different than compensation to management, and different to compensation to labor. And when we get people involved in a more complex farm operation, they will have different roles. They'll be wearing different hats. You can have situations where people have ownership but aren't actively involved in labor. You can have a management role but not have active involvement as an owner. So we need to understand what that compensation looks like given what their owner or stakeholder interest is in the business. The planning is great. We need to look at how we best utilize the management resources that we have. The management resources around operations, marketing, HR, and finance. How do we best allocate the resources that we have to work with? Number 9, continuous management development. You could, and actually, maybe I should do this, but you could draw another line, another life cycle, another timeline underneath the business life cycle and the personal life cycle, and call it management or professional development. Because farms, as they move along those life cycles, they need you guys, whoever the people that are planning towards their farming futures, need to try to, as best they can, continue to advance their management development. And the last one is marketing. So marketing of what it is that you produce, but also marketing what it is you're doing in the business. So 10 requirements for effective planning. And coming down here, Chris, to the end of the formal presentation here, 2 more quotes. Eisenhower said that plans are nothing, planning is everything. And when I think about that, it's completely appropriate to what we're talking about here, and that's farm families planning towards their future. The plan at the end of the day, whether it's, as I said, 3 pages or 30 pages, as detailed or as complex as it needs to be, what's of real value here is the planning process. And that's why at the very first slide, I captioned it business planning, not business plan. And yeah, this is not typically a straight path forward. It hasn't been a straight path for farm families to get to where they are today. Oh, I don't know who said it, but every path has a puddle. And so I'm going to mute my mic here. Thank everybody who attended today. I apologize for any challenges you may have had with the technology here, and I'll wait to hear from you, Chris, to see if there are any questions.
Terry, great as always. Thank you very much. I'm going to be very selfish and hog the question, the first spot here for myself. I could go on a whole rant about listening to people say how busy they are and the busy argument. In your estimation, are people as busy as they say? And if they indeed are, what are your suggestions to mitigating that? So, if someone's actually overwhelmed.
I think, Chris, I think farms generally are as busy as they claim to be. I think that's a reality that we all deal with, and I think there's 2 or 3 things they could do. First would be pretty simple. Don't use it as an excuse. So if there's a commitment to want to bring more structure to what it is you're working towards, and you can make the time. It's about priority. Chris, it goes back to the comment about the business is usually a function of an operational focus, and that may need to change. So the first comment I would have would be to agree within the family or within your individual not to use busyness as an excuse. And the second thing then would be to put some structure to the planning. And one can be to do it within the family, but another one could be to engage somebody to speak to. It doesn't have to be a consultant or an accountant, or It could be somebody at Farm Management Canada, somebody that you speak to that declares what it is you intend to do, because then by way of doing that, there is accountability to it. And the third thing is I'm a great proponent of setting a meeting. So if farm families here on this call think that, yeah, you know, I want to do it, but I'm pretty busy, and to your point, then I'm going to suggest that you call a meeting within your family for next week. Half an hour, and then at the end of that meeting, set the date for the next meeting. So Chris, some three simple things that could help farm families deal with busyness.
Brilliant, thanks. So Danielle is asking a question from an angle of a startup farm business. Do you have any unique elements or suggestions that are crucial in the beginning of just starting up a farm?
It would help if I kind of understood what farm business she had in mind. But I think I think the first thing would be get clarity around two things. One, what would they? I mean, this is just going to go back to the textbook and back to the presentation, Chris. But to write down where they ideally would like to be 5 years from now, and then step back and assess whether or not they think that's achievable. And if they think it's an achievable goal, then I would start to apply the structure of planning towards it. The process works, Chris. It works. It can work for everybody, even somebody in startup. But I think in a very first step then would be to write down what it is where they would love to be in 5 years, from zero to startup.
Carmen has a question. I had scribbled down something about how you could pad the fear of risk. And Carmen is asking, can you speak to the relationship or value of doing comprehensive financial analysis with market prices and weather being such strong factors to make or break a year and being outside of our control?
I think what helps. I'm going to say it. I'm going to be a little bit more direct, Chris. What I know helps is using a trend line of performance. So 5 years historically is helpful, because and the point's well taken. In any given year, whether price change, price risk can significantly impact on what's going on in the business. But if you take 5 years historically, I mean, you could go longer. You could go 10 years, but let's go 5 years. If you have 5 years of really good financial information, they will give you an idea of how your farm has performed through any of the weather events or the price cycles, the impacts on the price cycles in the last 5 years. So that's number one. And then number two, once you get that historical information captured, then I think you step back and you say, okay, so if we're going to use this as foundational to where we think the farm will get to financially in the future, did those 5 years, in fact, adequately take into account any weather events or any downturn in prices? Because I had this discussion with a farmer actually south of the city here not that long ago. And he said to me, he says, we've had 5 great years. So what we talked about was to the point here, do we use that 5 years as a baseline for going forward? Because likely not. Likely there are going to be weather events or price cycles, yield challenges. So I think you first start with looking at the history. Number two, then, understand if it does, in the farm's opinion, adequately take into account the number of a bad year or two. And if yes, great. If no, then we need to make some adjustment to it so it's will. So it will. So it will take into account. And if I might just ramble on for a minute here, Chris, what I ask farmers then in that discussion is, how many, in your mind, from, I guess, from a financial risk perspective, how many years in 5 do you expect there to be a bad year or a good year or average years? And if they say, well, and it's usually 1 or 2 bad years and one or 2 good years, and of course the difference in being that the average year. But my point in that then is to make sure within the farm family that they've got the right financial, or the right amount of financial, the right historical financial information to use when they're making their future discussions. Their future decisions. Because to that person's point, there will be weather events in the future, and there will be price impacts in the future. That's that.
Thanks, Terry. Well, listen, we just have a couple minutes left. Maybe take a minute or 30 seconds, however long you want, to give us your final, your Dr. Phil final thoughts.
I have a couple, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity. One, I declared at the start that I have a passion for this. I love working with farm families. Nothing better in the world, in my opinion. And I love the engagement in those discussions about what it is they're doing and how can we plan around that. So I have a passion for it, and why I wanted to go back and state that is what comes with that is a bias. And I have a bias towards the benefit of planning. I think that steamer with a thunderstorm on her horizon, actually, I think it actually exists. I think that there's situations, farm families that, I don't want to do this planning, or they, we've heard about, we should have a plan, we should have a plan, we should have a plan. I just don't think it needs to be any more complex, or should be any more complex than what it is. It can be, Chris, really quite a simple process. You know what, it's like the Chinese proverb of when best to plant an oak tree. Well, 35 years ago or today. So if any of the farms, on the webinar here don't have a plan and they think they should have one, just start. Make it as simple as it needs to be.